Welcome. I'm Hernan Murdoch. We have been talking about verbal communications, and what we're going to do in this episode is take a look at what happens when we're wrapping up that interview. So, Kathleen, as we are looking at verbal communications and the build up towards it, what we do during it, we are getting now close to the end of it.
hmm
So, can you help us better understand what happens as you're wrapping up that meeting, that interview, and documentation requirements around it? So, let's start with what you do as you start to wind down that interview. What are some of the key things you need to keep in mind?
Sure. Well, our viewers might recall that I talked about the importance of getting in, doing the interview. Now we're talking about getting out. So, as we're ready to essentially say goodbye, it's important that we think about whether there are any deliverables. So, any future discussions that we might want to have, let's set them up now because it can be difficult to chase people after the fact. I know that's true for me. If I leave, you might have a hard time getting back in touch with me, or it'll just be less convenient.
Right.
If there's going to be a plan to provide your interview notes, not all audit groups do this, but some do. So if that is your practice, then make that plan, let them know what to expect. Of all the things that are here, the most important one is thank people. Thank them for their time. They gave up, minutes, perhaps hours of their day to spend it with you to help you with understanding how their system process or functional area works. So please sincerely thank them for their time because they're not going to get it back. And if you've
Right.
made good use of their time, they will be appreciative, not only of your thanks, but of the fact that you were very careful in how you used it.
That's right.
And then,
Yeah.
if you're physically together, of course, shake hands. And if you're not, virtually wave or shake hands or whatever virtually.
Mhm. Right. Yes, as I was thinking about what you just said relating to the process of thanking them for their time, I remember one of the early lessons starting out as an auditor. One of my managers, as we were walking away from the facility, he suggested we just turn around and take a look. And of course, there were a few lights still on in the building. And he just, again, to drive this point home, he basically said, think about how many of those people, maybe the ones you met with today,
Mm-hmm.
and now they have to go catch up on the work that they now still have to
Mm.
do because they spent time helping you do your job. So it just, again, those moments were very instrumental in my training over the years in becoming appreciative of the effort that people put in to help me do my job, and they still have to work late to do their job because that's not going away. So that is definitely an important thing to keep in mind. So I really, when you said that, it really brought back some of those memories back, and I want to
Yeah.
share it. I like to share those things with our audience.
Yeah.
In terms of notes, the other thing that comes to mind, and of course, I learned from some of the mistakes that I made early on, and part of that is waiting too long to copy
Mm-hmm.
those notes over. And I know some organizations, people walk into the interviews with their laptops and they keep notes as they go. But in many organizations, they still prefer people to use handwritten notes while you're meeting with a person. And then you, on your own time, you go back and you copy those notes and put them into some document. Well, if you wait too long, and this is
Mm-hmm.
what happened to me several times, and of course I learned from it, was that it took too long to copy those notes over. And your shorthand, you, of course, at the time, you know exactly what the shorthand comment was or that little note or whatever thing you did. When you go back, if you wait too long, you may not remember what that is. So it's very important to take those notes at the time and
Mm-hmm.
then to copy them over, transcribe them as quickly as possible because and we use the expression notes go cold
They
and
do.
or get cold, and then you get yourself in trouble because you don't know what you wrote. So I think it's a very good practice as well.
Well, to reiterate your appreciation for them spending time with you, you owe them. You owe them the courtesy of making sure that your notes are transcribed as quickly as practical. So I often will say to auditors that I meet that if you have a number of things to do over the course of a day, maybe you're going to talk to a few different people. don't schedule those meetings back to back. Give yourself at least a 15-minute break in between so that you can get things out of your head and into the page. It may not be the complete transcript that you want it to be yet, but you're absolutely right. We forget things. Or if we're asking people in different groups similar questions, we might corrupt our impressions of different things coming from different people, which is one of the common problems with notes. So you might see, I mean, there are different practices in terms of what the work product looks like, but getting things out of your head and into your work product is so, so vital.
Right.
So if you are recording, you're doing a recording, you may be able to have a full transcript. That's becoming more commonplace, but I wouldn't say that it is commonplace yet. It's
Yeah.
becoming more
In,
frequent.
in fact, I've had many conversations with individuals who tell me that recording is still frowned upon.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that has to do with privacy considerations. Some of it has to do also with it makes a person get tense about the
Mm-hmm.
prospect of having your conversation recorded. I just feel it's like it's going to be an interrogation
Right.
rather than an interview or a conversation. So be judicious about that as well. Technology is pervasive, and we want to leverage it as much as we can. But remember the cultural elements that we also try to manage and
Yes.
the relationship we want to continue to build and retain. So from that perspective, just give that some thought before you go about recording a meeting with someone.
Absolutely. So, absent the full transcript, actually, I should probably reorder this. I prefer narrative summaries or Q&A summaries.
Yes.
A question, or a topic with a written or a typed summary next to it as to what was discussed is great. Or you might have a narrative summary that sort of just has the arc of the story of the walkthrough or of the interview or of the meeting. So there's a few different options there. Whatever is preferable or whatever you think you can do in a more practical way, a more compelling way, I would opt for either narrative or Q&A. I heard this great tactic from a fellow auditor who prefers to take notes. She prefers to take notes on just a sheet of paper or a couple of sheets of paper, and instead of going on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, instead of putting it in portrait orientation, she turns her pages in landscape. And she has her questions or her topics on the left-hand margin, and that leaves her lots of space to fill in information. So the about a quarter of the page or a third of the page is dedicated to the questions or the topics, and the rest of the page, she can make all kinds of circuitous notes, and she can follow her own particular map of what was discussed. And she really likes doing that. I haven't done it myself, but it is intriguing.
It's a very interesting tip.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a very intriguing. In
Yeah.
the end, though, she still has to clarify all that information and get it into a more work paper ready
Mhm.
narrative. And so she does that step too, as we were saying. If we're talking about true meetings with multiple people, I would say your best option in your note taking is to mirror the agenda. So whatever the agenda was, let's make sure we get all of those points in as they were covered. And then if there's other business, as is sometimes happens in meetings, that should be the last piece of information in your meeting minutes.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to know if you've had similar problems that I have with these common problems with notes. Sometimes the balance between how much is a difficult one to strike. So too much detail, not enough detail. I tend to express myself briefly, and so I'm mindful of my brevity may not be sufficient for some of the people that I have worked with over the years. So we need to be able to, this is part of our working papers ultimately, and we need to make sure that it clearly tells the story of what this conversation was about. Who said what, who asked what, who said what, and how does that
Part of
support
what
the
I
audit?
found Part of what I found related to the documentation in terms of the notes is that you have to think in terms of anticipating
Mhm.
what someone who was not in the meeting will take away from the notes.
Right.
So are the notes clear enough to explain everything that happened or the conversation that took place and other things that you heard? So in some cases it becomes very hard because you're not having a word for word transcript,
Hmm.
but you still have to convey the meaning and the context and the implications of what you heard and the exchange that took place. So from that perspective, then I try to document abundantly in anticipation of the questions of someone who may not even not only that they were not at the meeting, but they may not be part of the audit at all. So from that perspective, you want to provide enough information that they can understand what happened. And the other thing that comes to mind is in terms of the structure. And having been a writer of narratives and notes myself, and a reviewer of other people's work, I can also speak from experience where I say that sometimes the structure is so convoluted that it's hard to follow what happened. And what ended up happening is that you get more confused, sometimes even more
Hmm.
confused when you're done than when you started. So from that perspective, the auditor needs to also give thought not only to what the content is, but also in terms of how that content is structured to make it sure that it's going to either follow chronological order or logical order, or just the rules of grammar are clear, and the structure is going to help the reader understand what the meaning is. So those are some of the two things. But I think you have a couple other thoughts there, right, in terms of common mistakes and things to be on the
Yes,
lookout for.
absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Um, I would say what I find unclear, what I find a fair amount is when interviewing a group, unclear question and unclear statement attribution. So if we're conducting an interview in a pair, who asked what questions is important. And if we're talking to more than one person, who gave the answer. That way, if there's any follow-up that needs to happen around these topics, that we know the people to go to rather than waste others' time that were not the right people to attribute a statement to.
Right.
This sometimes happens. I've noticed that this can happen more frequently when we're at a distance from each other. So we might be having a conversation over the phone, a conferencing software, or we might be using Zoom or one of the other platforms that are commonly used now for auditing and interviewing from a distance. So take the moment in the moment to ask who was that, because you're not necessarily going to recognize everyone's voices, because a lot of
Right.
times these interviews are at the beginning stages of the audit, and not everyone's great with voice recognition anyway. So let's make note of who asked what and who said what so that there won't be any confusion later on.
And that's one of the benefits of video conferencing as
Hmm.
opposed to just voice conferencing, because now you can see the person who said what. And in some cases, depending, again, if you record it, then you can see exactly who said what, and it's in the notes. Sometimes that's captured as well. But now you can see the person or see the people that you're talking with. And that, I believe, is a huge improvement to address that very point.
Right,
You're right. That's an important thing as well.
right.
In terms, and one of the things to also be mindful about is later on, if there's a further conversation, discussion about something that came up during the interviews, someone may say, "Well, I didn't say that." You know, someone said it, but you don't recall who.
Hmm.
And just that very point of disagreement can also put a lot of doubt as to what else you documented that may not be
Right,
accurate.
right.
So keeping those notes clear and accurate is so important. I believe accountability is also an important piece here, right? And what happens next, or what should be
Sure.
done next, or who does what. Is that right?
Yes. So when we talked about, sort of phasing out of the conversation, and then now we're talking about creating the work product. We want to make sure that we practiced what we preached and that we did note down what the agreed upon after actions were going to be on everyone's part. And if we've done that, then this is not going to be a problem. But if we haven't, it could be. It also, for me, makes a sound argument for sharing your notes with the person or the group that you interviewed, so as to clarify anything that can be clarified while it's still relatively fresh in everybody's mind. So I've been sharing my notes for many, many years in the projects that I do, and it's proven more than once that I've misunderstood something or I've misattributed something, and I can correct that close to the actual interaction rather than be embarrassed later on that I had it wrong.
Right. These are very important tips and things to keep in mind. So as we have taken a look at what happens in the preparation for the meeting with the client, during the meeting with the client, and as we get to the end of the meeting with the client, we want to make sure that we start well, conduct it well, and wrap up well. So thank you very much, Kathleen, for helping us make sure that we can follow the full life cycle and do it with high quality. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.